Some houses keep their secrets buried deep beneath the floorboards, but in the quiet hills of Missouri, one family's silence became a legend, a story of madness, disappearance, and the haunting truth that refused to stay hidden. Welcome to this journey into one of the most unsettling cases ever recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, please share in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're always curious to know the places and hours of day or night where these documented accounts find their listeners. In the cold winter of 1912, a small notice appeared in the Springfield Republican newspaper about a family dispute in Taney County, deep within the Ozark Mountains. The article, barely 3 short paragraphs, mentioned that local officers were called to look into the disappearance of a woman named Eliza Whitlock from her isolated home near the White River. Her husband, Thomas Whitlock, told authorities she had left willingly after a disagreement at home. The story ended there, stating that no further investigation was needed. What the paper did not mention was that this brief article marked the start of one of the strangest and darkest mysteries in Ozark history, a story that would remain buried and mostly forgotten for decades. The Whitlock property covered about 40 acres of rocky hills near a small settlement called Walnut Shade, roughly 15 miles south of Forsyth, the county seat. The home was a 2-story timber-framed house with a small barn and a few outbuildings. County documents from 1908 show that Thomas Whitlock bought the land after moving from Springfield, where he worked as a clerk at the Hears department store. He was described in those records as quiet, orderly, and private. His wife, formerly Eliza Crawford, had been a school teacher in Christian County before she married Thomas in 1905. They had 2 children, Edward, who was 6 years old in 1912, and Mary, who was 4. Neighbors remembered the Whitlocks as a withdrawn family who rarely took part in community gatherings. Thomas sometimes went to Forsyth or Branson for supplies, but Eliza was rarely seen beyond their land after their first year living there. Such isolation wasn't unusual in the Ozarks, where families could live miles apart, separated by deep hollows, limestone ridges, and thick forests of oak and pine. The region had long been a place where people went to disappear, from debts, from the law, or simply from the world. Joseph Miller, whose family owned the land to the east, said the Whitlocks seemed content during their early years on the property. Interviewed in 1952 by a researcher from the Missouri Historical Society, Miller recalled that Thomas was careful about his boundaries and not unfriendly, though he mostly kept to himself. The missus, he said, was quieter still, but the children looked healthy and well cared for. Miller remembered that in the fall of 1911, about 6 months before Eliza vanished, Thomas began making odd improvements, digging what looked like a new root cellar behind the house and adding extra locks to the doors. The last confirmed sighting of Eliza by anyone outside the family came in November 1911, when a local midwife named Harriet Bowman visited after receiving a message that Eliza was ill. In a statement given later to the Taney County Sheriff, Bowman said she found Eliza pale, distant, and nervous, though not sick. The house, she noted, was unusually cold even though the fire was burning, and Thomas stayed in the room the entire time, answering most of the questions directed at his wife. When Bowman suggested Eliza might see a doctor in Forsyth, Thomas replied that they couldn't afford such a thing and that his wife just needed rest. County bank records showed that during the autumn of 1911, Thomas made several withdrawals from the family's modest savings at the Taney County Bank, almost half of their total money between September and December. The bank manager, Harold Winters, said later that Thomas claimed the money was for home repairs and winter supplies. Winters admitted that such spending wasn't unheard of, but it seemed more than necessary for a small family like the Whitlocks. The winter of 1911-1912 was one of the harshest in Ozark history. Heavy snow in December and January trapped many mountain homesteads for weeks, cutting off contact with neighbors until early spring. Weather reports from Springfield recorded temperatures dropping near 0 Fahrenheit several times, with snow still on the ground by mid-March. During that lonely winter, sometime between late February and early March, Eliza Whitlock was said to have left her home. The exact day was never known. Thomas first mentioned her absence to Joseph Miller in late March, when they met on the road to Forsyth. "The missus has gone away," Thomas said flatly, and offered no more. Miller, used to his neighbor's privacy, asked no questions. Store ledgers from Forsyth show that on March 4, 1912, Thomas bought a large amount of canned food, coffee, and lamp oil, enough for weeks. The shopkeeper, Jeremiah Collins, wrote later in his personal journal that Thomas seemed uneasy and avoided small talk. When Collins asked how Mrs. Whitlock was, Thomas replied sharply, "She's not my concern right now. The matter might have stayed hidden if not for Eliza's sister, Catherine Crawford, who lived in Springfield." She hadn't heard from Eliza in months. In early April, Catherine wrote to the Walnut Shade postmaster, asking about her sister. The postmaster replied that Eliza had reportedly left her family. Concerned, Catherine traveled to Taney County and asked Sheriff James Harmon to investigate. Her personal journal, later donated to the Missouri State Archives, describes her growing worry. On April 10, 1912, she wrote, "I cannot believe Eliza would leave her children." Her letters had become guarded since her marriage, but her love for Edward and Mary was clear in every line. Something is terribly wrong. Sheriff Harmon visited the Whitlock home on April 18, 1912. His official report said the property looked well kept. Thomas and the children were present. Both children appeared fed and clothed, though unusually quiet. Thomas told the sheriff that Eliza had left on her own after complaining about their lonely life. He said she took a small case of personal items and might have gone back to Springfield, though Catherine insisted Eliza had not contacted anyone. Harmon searched the house but found no signs of violence. Eliza's clothes and some belongings were missing, which seemed to support Thomas's story. The sheriff concluded there was no sign of foul play, just a woman who chose to leave her home. With that, the investigation was closed, despite Catherine's protests. However, Harmon's private notebook, found among his papers after his death in 1931, revealed what he didn't include in the official record. "Whitlock was too calm for a man recently deserted," he wrote. "The children looked to their father before answering every question. The boy started to speak of his mother, but stopped when Whitlock cleared his throat." Behind the house was a patch of freshly turned soil. He said it was a new garden bed, but the shape was wrong, too narrow, too long. The sheriff's private words suggest he suspected Thomas of something terrible but lacked proof. "Without a body or a witness," he wrote, "there's no crime to pursue. Family matters in these hills are kept private, and the county lacks funds for long investigations." Catherine went home to Springfield but could not forget her sister. She tried sending letters and small gifts to the children, but only received short, formal replies from Thomas. In June 1912, she returned to Taney County, hoping to see Edward and Mary. Thomas refused, saying her visits disturbed their routine. Catherine's final journal note about the matter, dated July 3, 1912, reads, "I fear I have failed Eliza. Without proof or authority, I cannot act. I only pray that if she lives, she finds her way back to them, or to me." For years afterward, Eliza's disappearance remained a quiet local secret. Thomas stayed on the farm, raising the children with help from a local woman named Martha Jenkins. She came several times a week to cook, clean, and care for the children. Jenkins later told a neighbor that Thomas instructed her never to speak of Eliza to the children and to tell them only that their mother would return when she got better. In 1952, decades later, Jenkins, then elderly and living in a Branson nursing home, was interviewed during a renewed investigation. According to the transcript, she said Thomas had strict rules about certain places on the property. No one was to go near the root cellar, she recalled. Once, when little Mary wandered too close, Thomas grabbed her so roughly she burst into tears. He later apologized, saying dangerous tools were kept there. Jenkins said Thomas often stayed up at night, pacing the house, muttering about keeping watch and holding the barriers. Sometimes she'd find him at dawn sitting at the kitchen table, looking exhausted, as though he hadn't slept at all. She admitted it made her uneasy, but thought it was the strain of raising 2 children alone. Like most in the area, she believed it best not to interfere in a man's family affairs. By 1913, Edward and Mary began attending the one-room schoolhouse in Walnut Shade. Their teacher, Abigail Thornton, wrote in her diary that the 2 children were polite but withdrawn. Edward, she said, had a haunting stillness and would sometimes sit staring at nothing for long stretches. In October 1913, when a visitor tried to ask Mary about her mother, the girl became hysterical. That same day, Thomas arrived at the school, removed both children, and kept them home for 2 weeks. Thornton's diary, later donated to the Taney County Historical Society, also mentions that Edward often came to school with dark circles under his eyes, saying the noises at night kept him awake. When she asked what noises, he said nothing more. Mary, though more social, showed what the teacher called an unusual fascination with burials. She once found drawings in Mary's desk showing a figure lying underground with flowers above it. By spring 1914, Edward's behavior worsened. Thornton wrote that he had spells where he would go silent and stare blankly. After one such episode, he whispered over and over, "She's still digging." Thornton later spoke to Thomas about her concerns. Her diary entry from April 12, 1914 reads, "Mr. Whitlock met my concern with cold anger. He told me that his son's behavior was no one's business but his own, and my comments were unwelcome. I worry deeply for these children, but what can I really do?" Those were the words of one concerned neighbor, but her worry brought no change. Mr. Whitlock had threatened to take his children out of school completely if anyone dared to question him again. So the matter was quietly dropped, and the Whitlock family continued their lonely existence on that isolated property. They stayed there until 1917, when Thomas suddenly sold the homestead and moved with his 2 children to Kansas City. County documents later showed that he sold the property to a man named James Harker, a cattle rancher from Arkansas, and for far less than the land's official value. Harker told neighbors afterward that Thomas seemed desperate to finish the deal quickly and accepted the very first offer he received. The timing of the family's departure matched growing attention from local officials. Files from the Taney County School Board, uncovered decades later in 1952, revealed that Abigail Thornton had finally reported her suspicions about the Whitlock children to the county superintendent in March 1917. The superintendent responded by sending Thomas a letter asking for a meeting to discuss the children's welfare. Post office records confirm that this letter was delivered on April 3, 1917. The next day, Thomas listed his property for sale, and by the end of that same month, the sale was completed. When James Harker took ownership of the land, he began fixing up parts of the property and demolished what was left of the root cellar behind the house. His son, William Harker, would later tell investigators in 1952 that his father had described that cellar as strange, deeper than any normal produce cellar and oddly divided into several small sections by interior walls. William also said his father found a few peculiar objects while tearing it down. Among them was a woman's hairbrush with strands of dark hair still caught in it, buried about 2 feet beneath the cellar floor. James Harker didn't think much of it at the time, assuming it was just old rubbish left behind by the previous owners. The Harker family held on to the Whitlock land until 1933, when the Great Depression forced them to sell. Over the next 20 years, the property changed hands several times and slowly fell into ruin. The original house aged badly, and later owners focused their attention on other parts of the land, leaving the old buildings to decay. By 1950, the house stood mostly empty, visited occasionally by local teenagers who treated it as a gathering place. Rumors began spreading that the place was haunted by a crying woman whose voice could sometimes be heard on still nights. For many years after that, the story of Eliza Whitlock's disappearance faded almost completely from memory. The family's move away from Taney County, combined with the chaos of World War I and the deadly influenza epidemic that followed, pushed the case into silence. It might have stayed forgotten forever, if not for what happened in 1952. That year, the long-abandoned Whitlock property, overgrown with brush and nearly hidden by trees, was purchased by Walter and Ruth Simmons, a couple from St. Louis who wanted to build a hunting lodge. On June 12, 1952, a report filed with the Taney County Sheriff's Department described what they discovered while clearing the land. Behind the deteriorating old house, the Simmonses found what appeared to be the caved-in entrance to an old cellar or underground storage space. While investigating it, they noticed a small leather-bound book wedged between two limestone blocks in the cellar foundation. The book had been badly damaged by dampness and time, but it was soon identified as a diary belonging to Eliza Whitlock, with entries ranging from January 1910 to February 1912. Ruth Simmons later told the Springfield News Leader about her discovery. The pages were all stuck together, and much of the ink had run, but you could still see the handwriting in parts. What struck me most was how the writing changed. In the beginning, the handwriting was neat and calm, but near the end it looked wild and shaky, like it was written by someone terrified. The diary led Sheriff William Masterson to reopen the long, cold Whitlock case. Though many pages were ruined, enough survived to reveal the disturbing final years of Eliza's life. The early entries described ordinary rural routines, cooking, chores, and her children, but over time, her tone changed. She began expressing fear and confusion about her husband's strange behavior. An entry from August 14, 1911 reads, "T watches me constantly, says the house isn't safe enough. He talks about dangers I cannot see. When I mentioned visiting my sister, his face changed in a way that frightened me." A later entry from October 3rd said, "The children can no longer go beyond the yard. T nailed our bedroom window shut, claiming it was to keep out the cold, but the first frost hasn't even come." By November, things grew worse. That month, Eliza wrote, "The midwife came today. I wanted to speak freely, but could not. He stood by, listening to every word. When she left, he said no one else would ever enter our home again. He says outsiders bring contamination." In December, she recorded something more chilling. "The new room beneath the house is nearly done. T works on it at night when he thinks I'm asleep. He calls it a sanctuary, but it feels like a tomb." On January 8, 1912, Eliza wrote one of the most haunting lines. "This morning, I found Edward standing at the cellar door. When I asked what he was doing, he said, 'Father says we'll all sleep there soon when the time comes.' When I asked T about it, he grew furious, accused me of turning the children against him, and didn't leave my side all day." Her next entries became shorter, as if she was writing in haste. On January 23rd, she wrote, "Tonic he gives me every night makes me weak and confused. I started pouring it into my plant instead. The plant died within days." By February 2nd, she wrote simply, "I have to take the children and leave. But how? Snow is deep. We're far from town. He's hidden my coat and boots. Says it's to keep me from catching cold, but I know why." The final entry, dated February 17th, read only 3 lines. "He found these pages tonight. His rage was terrible. The children are locked in their room. I hear him digging again." After reading the diary, Sheriff Masterson ordered an excavation of the cellar ruins. On June 18, 1952, investigators unearthed human remains, later confirmed through dental records to be those of Eliza Whitlock. The medical report revealed she had suffered a violent blow to the head before being buried face down in a shallow grave. Her hands had been tied behind her back with wire. Dr. Lawrence Wilson, who performed the autopsy, noted that Eliza had been about 32 years old, matching her known age, and that an old fracture on her left wrist had healed long before her death. More importantly, chemical tests showed traces of a sedative compound in the preserved tissue, supporting the diary's mention of the tonic Thomas forced her to drink. Once the discovery became public, police searched for Thomas Whitlock and his surviving children. Records showed that Thomas had died in 1931 in a Kansas City hospital from pneumonia. His son, Edward, was killed during World War II in 1944. The only surviving family member was his daughter, Mary Whitlock, now Mary Coleman, living in Omaha, Nebraska with her husband and 3 children. Investigators found additional records from the Kansas City Public Library detailing the family's life after 1917. Thomas had worked as a night watchman at a warehouse until his health failed in 1928. Edward attended school up to the 8th grade, then joined his father at the warehouse. Former neighbors described Thomas as a stern, private man who rarely spoke of his past. One woman, Estelle Parker, recalled that he never mentioned his late wife and would become visibly upset if anyone brought her up. Mary had married Richard Coleman, an insurance salesman, in 1929 and moved to Omaha soon after. On her marriage certificate, she listed her mother as deceased, even though no death certificate for Eliza existed at the time. Investigators believed that either her father told her her mother had died, or Mary chose to write that herself to avoid explaining her absence. When questioned by Missouri authorities in July 1952, Mary Coleman said she remembered nothing about her mother's disappearance. She said her father always told her that her mother had abandoned the family, and she had believed him. However, her husband privately told investigators that Mary suffered from recurring nightmares about a woman calling from beneath the floorboards. He said she was terrified of enclosed spaces and avoided basements entirely. In a letter preserved in the case file, Richard Coleman wrote, "Mary has suffered from what doctors call anxiety attacks for as long as I've known her. They're often triggered by certain sounds, especially digging or scraping, or by objects like shovels or root cellars. She refuses to go into our basement. If I ask her why, she becomes distant and changes the subject." More fragments of the truth came from elderly residents of Taney County who still remembered the Whitlocks. One woman, Clara Jensen, said that when she was a little girl, her father once saw Thomas Whitlock in Forsyth buying an unusually large amount of quicklime. When asked what it was for, Thomas said it was to keep moisture out of the cellar walls. Clara also remembered her parents whispering about strange noises coming from the direction of the Whitlock home that winter. Sounds her father said must have been the wind or wild animals. Her brother Harold recalled a chilling encounter with young Edward Whitlock that same spring. Harold said he met Edward near the fence dividing their lands. The boy seemed nervous and asked, "Do you think people can hear things through the ground?" Harold asked what he meant, and Edward replied, "Father says no one can hear anything once it's packed down tight. But I think I still can, sometimes." Before Harold could ask more, Thomas appeared suddenly and called his son home. Harold told his parents about it, but they dismissed it as childish nonsense. And so the terrible truth of what happened in that lonely house stayed buried beneath layers of time, silence, and Missouri soil until the earth itself finally gave it back. Further research into Thomas Whitlock's past uncovered a possible reason for his growing paranoia in the months before Eliza disappeared. Records from the State Lunatic Asylum in Nevada, Missouri, now called the Nevada State Hospital, showed that Thomas's father, William Whitlock, had been admitted there in 1890 after suffering violent and paranoid delusions. The elder Whitlock reportedly became convinced that his wife was working against him with their neighbors and even tried to lock her inside their home. The hospital records state that William Whitlock died there in 1902, with notes mentioning a possible inherited tendency toward paranoid thinking. The asylum files also contained a letter written in 1895 by Thomas's mother, Sarah Whitlock, to the hospital director. In that letter, she expressed worry about her son's nervous nature and asked if her husband's condition might pass to their children. The director replied, his letter was preserved in the file as well, that mental illness was not always inherited, though he suggested that Thomas should be encouraged to choose work that avoided too much stress or isolation, showing that even then people suspected a family link to mental disorders. In October 1952, Professor Alan Matthews, a historian studying Ozark folklore at the University of Missouri, visited the old Whitlock property at the invitation of the new owners. Matthews carefully documented the layout of the land and the exact location where Eliza's remains had been found. His notes, now stored in the university archives, describe how lonely and hidden the property was. The homestead sat in a narrow valley surrounded by steep, wooded hills on three sides. Even at midday, parts of the yard were still covered in shadow. The nearest neighbor's house was less than a mile away, but due to the rugged terrain, it couldn't be seen from the Whitlock home. Matthews observed that someone could scream there and not be heard beyond the surrounding hills. He also recorded local tales that had grown around the property after the Whitlocks left. Some residents of Walnut Shade claimed they avoided the place, saying travelers passing the abandoned house at night sometimes heard a woman crying or the sound of someone digging. Matthews wrote that these stories were common for old deserted properties in the Ozarks, but in this case the reports might have come from real sounds people heard during the winter of 1911 and 1912. In his field journal, Matthews noted, "The echo in this valley is strange. When I stood where the old root cellar used to be, I did a small test, dropping stones into the hole that remains and listening to how the sound carried. Even a small noise makes an echo that bounces between the limestone cliffs. It occurs to me that if someone had been digging here at night when everything is quiet, the sound might travel far enough to make passers-by think they heard something ghostly." The case of Eliza Whitlock was officially closed in December 1952. Her death was ruled a homicide, with Thomas Whitlock named as the responsible party. Her remains were buried in Springfield Cemetery beside her parents and sister. The story was briefly covered in local newspapers, but was soon forgotten amid bigger national events. The Taney County Historical Society still keeps a small file on the case, including copies of the original sheriff's reports, parts of Eliza's diary, and newspaper clippings about the 1952 discovery. One document in the file is a transcript of an interview with Richard Anderson, who had served as a deputy under Sheriff James Harmon in 1912. When the 1952 investigation began, Anderson was in his late 70s. He recalled that Sheriff Harmon had remained haunted by the Whitlock case long after it had officially ended. Anderson remembered Harmon saying more than once that sometimes the law's limits mean justice must wait. Anderson believed the sheriff suspected foul play but didn't have the evidence or means to pursue it. The last major development in the Whitlock case came in 1968. Mary Coleman's eldest son, Robert, contacted the Taney County Historical Society, asking for information about his grandparents. Records show that Robert had recently discovered a bundle of his mother's childhood drawings hidden in their attic after her death from cancer earlier that year. The drawings, made when Mary was between 5 and 8 years old, all showed a similar image: a small female figure under the ground or beneath floorboards, with stick figures standing above her. One drawing, labeled in childish handwriting as "Mama Sleeping," showed what looked like a man digging. Dr. Eleanor Mitchell, a psychologist who studied the drawings at the request of the Historical Society, wrote an analysis that remains in the file. Mitchell observed that the drawings showed signs typical of children who have lived through trauma. The repeated dark themes, the heavy pressure of certain lines, especially those marking the ground, and the images of figures buried or trapped all suggested deep emotional distress. Mitchell concluded, "These drawings strongly indicate that the child who created them witnessed or knew about a disturbing event involving the burial of a female, most likely her mother. The repetition of the imagery shows it was not imagination, but a lasting memory or obsession." Robert Coleman later visited the old Whitlock land during the summer of 1968. By then, the original house was gone, replaced by a hunting lodge. In a letter he sent afterward to the Historical Society, he wrote, "Standing there, I felt deep sorrow, not only for the grandmother I never knew, but for my mother, who carried this hidden truth her whole life. Some secrets refuse to stay buried no matter how deep." Robert went on to describe his mother as a kind and gentle woman, but distant, as if part of her soul was still trapped in that valley in the Ozarks. He said Mary had never spoken about her childhood and would react with visible anxiety whenever her children asked about her parents. "Now I understand why," he wrote. "She was protecting us from a truth she couldn't face herself, that her father had murdered her mother and made her live with that silence forever." The Whitlock story became an example of what criminologists later called a pattern found in many rural areas. The way isolation and privacy can allow domestic violence to grow unchecked. In the early 1900s, Ozarks, homes were far apart, and people believed it was wrong to interfere in family matters. A woman like Eliza Whitlock had almost no way to escape once her husband's mind began to break down. The next neighbor was miles away, and in winter, travel was nearly impossible. Even when others grew worried, like the midwife Harriet Bowman or the teacher Abigail Thornton, local authorities lacked the power and resources to help. Professor Matthews, in a paper he published in 1954 in the Journal of Ozark Studies, used the Whitlock case to highlight patterns of rural crime and community behavior. He wrote that Thomas Whitlock's position as head of the household gave him near total control over his family in the eyes of the community. People who might have noticed something wrong were hesitant to act, clinging to the belief that a man's home is his castle. Matthews argued that this mix of physical isolation and cultural silence created a situation where family abuse could happen without detection or consequence. The emotional damage to the Whitlock children became another part of the case that psychologists studied. Dr. Mitchell, in her analysis of Mary's drawings, suggested that the young girl had developed a mental barrier to survive what she had seen. Instead of accepting the awful truth of her father's crime, Mary's mind separated it from her awareness. Mitchell wrote, "Mary seems to have built a wall in her memory, dividing what she knew from what she could consciously bear. This mental separation is common in children who experience severe trauma. It allows them to function day to day, though their mind remains split. Today, the land where the Whitlock home once stood is part of a recreational area. Most visitors have no idea what happened there. The limestone cliffs still cast long shadows over the valley, and at dusk, when the wind moves through the hollow, some say they can hear faint sounds as if a woman's voice still calls from under the earth." What makes the story of Eliza Whitlock so chilling is not only her death, but the silence that surrounded it. In those small Ozark communities of the early 1900s, privacy was sacred, and people stayed out of others' family business. That deep respect for privacy allowed terrible things to happen without questions being asked. The diary found in 1952 remains our only direct view into Eliza's final months, her fear as her husband's mind unraveled, her worry for her children, her growing sense of being trapped. Her writing shows a woman who understood the danger she was in, but had nowhere to turn. The world she lived in offered little help to wives or mothers. Perhaps the most haunting part of the story is the silence that followed. Her children, especially Mary, buried their memories along with her. They built walls in their minds to survive. But when Mary's drawings surfaced after her death, they revealed that some part of her always knew what happened, that her art told the truth her words could not. Local historian Margaret Branson, who studied the Whitlock case for decades, wrote in 2012, on the 100th anniversary of Eliza's disappearance, "What happened in that lonely valley was not only the murder of a woman by her ill husband, it was the murder of truth itself." Thomas Whitlock buried his wife twice, first in the earth behind their home, then in the story he told that erased her existence. The children, too young to fully understand, were forced to live within that lie, carrying the hidden truth for the rest of their lives. The Whitlock case reminds us that the worst horrors don't always come from monsters or strangers, but from the slow decay of safety within the home, from fear, isolation, and silence. In the deep hollows of the Ozarks, where sound echoes and darkness falls early, Eliza's story reminds us that the most dangerous monsters are ordinary people whose minds have turned against them and those they once loved. For experts who study such tragedies, the Whitlock story shows how isolation can worsen mental illness, how old cultural rules can protect abusers, and how truth, no matter how long it is buried, will one day rise again. Decades after Eliza's remains were found, modern psychology had developed methods that might have recognized Thomas Whitlock's illness before it led to violence. Laws, too, have changed to better protect victims. Yet even now, similar stories happen in remote places where privacy still hides cruelty. The limestone ground of the Ozarks eventually gave up what Thomas tried to conceal, but for 40 years Eliza lay forgotten, known only to the man who killed her, and perhaps to her children, who carried that horror in dreams and silence. That silence, more than anything, is the true terror of the Whitlock case. It speaks louder than words to those who listen. Dr. Samuel Hirsch, a forensic psychiatrist, reviewed the case in 1960 for an article in the American Journal of Autopsy Psychiatry. He suggested that Thomas Whitlock probably suffered from what would now be diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenia, similar to his father's condition. Hirsch explained that Thomas's symptoms followed the typical pattern, starting in his late 20s, growing over time from simple suspicion to deep delusion. His paranoia grew worse, shifting from mistrust of neighbors to fear for his family's safety, and finally to believing his wife was dangerous or corrupted. Hirsch said this fit known examples of untreated psychosis. What made the Whitlock case unusual, Hirsch noted, was how long Thomas kept up a false appearance of normal life after the murder. Most family killers either take their own lives or are caught quickly. But Thomas managed to live in society for almost 20 years, keeping his secret. Hirsch wrote, "Whitlock's ability to maintain a believable story that his wife had abandoned him and to function publicly shows that part of him still knew his actions were wrong. He concealed them because he understood that others would condemn him." Psychologists were also deeply interested in how the Whitlock children reacted to their trauma. Edward Whitlock's school records found during the 1952 investigation showed his grades fell sharply and his behavior worsened after his mother's disappearance. His teacher described moments when Edward seemed lost, unresponsive, or as if he heard sounds others could not. Today, such symptoms would likely be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Mary's reaction was different. While Edward's suffering was visible, Mary seemed to adapt more easily, perhaps because she was younger when it happened. Dr. Mitchell suggested that children aged 3 or 4 don't fully understand permanence or cause and effect. So Mary might have been more willing to accept her father's story, even as the real truth lived in her unconscious mind, coming out through her drawings. In adulthood, Mary's trauma showed itself in subtle but powerful ways. Her husband later told investigators she was gentle but anxious, afraid of tight spaces, unable to bear the sound of digging, and often emotionally distant. This ability to live normally in most ways while keeping painful memories sealed away is a known coping mechanism in trauma survivors. Robert Coleman, Mary's son, also wrote about how her fears shaped his own childhood. In his letters to the Historical Society, he said his mother was overly protective, so much so that it sometimes caused tension with his father. She became frantic if we were out of her sight even for a few minutes, he wrote. She made strict rules about where we could play. We were never allowed in the basement or to dig holes in the yard. At the time, it made no sense, but now I realize those fears came from her own buried past. The community's reaction to Eliza's disappearance reflected the larger attitudes of early 20th century rural America. When Sheriff Harmon looked into the case in 1912, he worked within a system that valued family privacy and male authority. Domestic disputes were considered private matters, not crimes. Without hard proof and with Thomas offering a believable explanation, Harmon's hands were tied. Neighbors who saw signs of trouble, Thomas's isolation, his odd changes to the property, his agitated behavior, interpreted these things through the limited understanding of their time. Mental illness was heavily stigmatized and poorly understood, often seen as weakness rather than a medical issue. A family withdrawing from society might raise curiosity, but it was rarely seen as cause for action, especially in a region that prized independence and self-reliance. Even those closest to the family, like Eliza's sister Catherine Crawford, were powerless. As a woman, she had no legal right to demand access to her niece and nephew or to push for a deeper investigation. In her journal, she wrote bitterly, "If Eliza were merely property gone missing, the law would act. But a woman who might have chosen to leave, that is her right, no matter how unlikely." Dr. Elaine Foster, a criminologist, later examined the case in her 1980 study of rural homicides. She said the Ozarks' geography and culture allowed what she called invisible crimes, acts of violence hidden by distance and social custom. In cities, she wrote, a disappearance is noticed because people are connected, but in remote regions like the early Ozarks, a woman could vanish almost without question, especially if her existence was defined through her husband. Foster argued that the 40-year delay in uncovering Eliza's death wasn't just an investigative failure, it showed a larger blindness toward violence within families. The land itself played a role. The rough terrain, deep valleys, and thick woods of the Ozarks made it easy to hide secrets. During Prohibition, those same hills had sheltered illegal distilleries. In the Whitlock case, the secluded valley meant no one could see or hear what happened. The harsh winter of 1911-1912, with snow and freezing cold, made visitors even rarer. Professor Matthews later noted that the limestone soil, by chance, helped preserve both Eliza's remains and her diary. The dryness and alkaline composition slowed decay, allowing identification decades later. In wetter or more acidic ground, Matthews wrote, the evidence might have vanished completely. When Walter and Ruth Simmons stumbled upon Eliza's diary in 1952, they unknowingly set in motion the final uncovering of a truth buried for 40 years.